The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the comfortable kind. Not the silence of a forest after rain. Or the stillness that settles over a house when everyone finally sleeps. This was the silence of held breath. Of people pretending not to watch. Of a room full of wolves who had already decided what I was before I opened the door. I stood at the entrance of the Iron Peak Pack's main hall, my worn canvas bag clutched against my chest like a shield that couldn't stop anything, and I counted 12 pairs of eyes refusing to meet mine. The Omega workers moving through the corridor suddenly found urgent business in the opposite direction. A senior she-wolf with a clipboard paused mid-step, looked me over from my scuffed boots to my pale blonde hair, tied back because I'd learned not to draw attention to anything, and then turned away with something caught between pity and relief. Relief, I realized. Because it wasn't her walking through that door. It was me. My name is Daisy, and 3 weeks ago my pack rejected me. Not metaphorically, not emotionally. Formally, publicly, in front of 63 witnesses, my alpha stood before the pack circle and severed the bond. He didn't look at me when he said the words. None of them did, except Cole, my cousin, my closest friend since childhood, who watched from the back with his jaw so tight I thought it might crack. But he didn't speak. None of them spoke for me. I was 23 years old, an Omega with no formal placement, no family pack bond, and a reference letter from a mid-ranking she-wolf who felt guilty enough about the whole thing to write 4 sentences on my behalf. 4 sentences. That was the sum of my worth as far as the shifter employment registry was concerned. So when Iron Peak Pack posted an opening for a live-in domestic assistant, specifically for the Alpha King's private residence, specifically involving childcare, I applied because I had nothing else. Not because I was brave. I want to be very clear about that. I was not brave. I was just out of options. The hall smelled like pine resin and something older, something dark and territorial that pressed against the back of my throat. Iron Peak was not like any pack I'd grown up near. It was the seat of the Alpha King's territory, not a regional alpha, not a city pack leader, but the king himself. Draven Ashvale. Even the name had weight. Every shifter in the Northern Territories knew it, spoke it carefully, the way you'd speak near something that could hear you. You must be the new applicant. The woman who appeared from a side corridor was tall, angular, with iron-gray hair pulled back so severely it seemed to be pulling her eyebrows up in permanent skepticism. She had the kind of posture that made you straighten your own spine instinctively. Daisy Marrow, I said, and hated that my voice came out smaller than I intended. I have an appointment with... I know who you have an appointment with. She plucked the folder from under her arm and opened it without looking up. I'm Hessa, head of household staff. I manage hiring, dismissal, and everything in between. She finally looked at me over the top of the folder. We've had 11 applicants in the past 4 months. Do you know what they all had in common? I shook my head. They all left. She let that sit in the air for a moment. Some lasted a week. The last one made it to day 9 before she requested emergency reassignment. The one before that, a trained Gamma with 8 years of childcare experience, submitted her resignation in writing at 2 a.m. and was gone before breakfast. The silence pressed in again. I could hear, distantly, something crashing. Then a high-pitched shriek that might have been laughter or fury or both. The king's sons, Hessa said, as though that explained everything. And maybe it did. I'd heard things. Rumors traveled fast in the Omega networks, the informal web of lower-ranked wolves who passed information between packs through quiet conversations and careful warnings. 3 boys, ages 4, 6, and 8. The Alpha King's heirs, motherless since before the youngest could walk, raised in a household built around power and grief, and very few boundaries. They were described, depending on who you asked, as feral, brilliant, impossible, exhausting, and terrifying in the specific way that only children with nothing left to lose can be. "I'm not easily startled," I said. It wasn't a boast. It was just true. When you grow up as the only omega in a mid-ranking pack, when you spend years learning how to make yourself small without disappearing entirely, you develop a particular tolerance for chaos. Hessa studied me with the practiced assessment of someone who had interviewed many people and trusted very few of them. "You were rejected," she said flatly. Not cruelly, just directly. "Yes." "Your reference says you're calm under pressure, adaptable. Quote," she glanced at the paper, "demonstrates unusual emotional steadiness in difficult environments." She lowered the folder. "What she didn't write, but what I can see, is that you came here because no one else would take you." It should have stung more than it did. Maybe I was already past the point where that kind of honesty hurt. "Yes," I said again, "but that doesn't mean I'll run." Something shifted in Hessa's expression. Not warmth, exactly. More like the faint recalibration of someone adjusting an estimate upward by the smallest fraction. "The position is room and board, plus stipend," she said, closing the folder. "You'll be responsible for morning routines, meals, basic education supervision, and general order. The boy's nanny, to the extent that title means anything anymore, is you. The king's schedule keeps him occupied until evening. You will not seek him out. You will not interrupt his work. You will handle whatever arises during the day independently." "Understood," I said. "Come." She led me through the hall and up a wide stone staircase, past walls hung with old pack crests and the quiet weight of history. The crashing sound grew louder. And then, as we turned down a corridor on the second floor, I heard it clearly. A voice, young and furious. I said, "I don't want a new one." Something heavy struck a door from the inside. The wall actually shuddered. Hessa didn't flinch. I didn't either, though my heartbeat did something complicated. She stopped before the door at the end of the corridor and looked at me one last time. "The oldest is Roan, 8 years old. He's the one you need to watch. Intelligent, territorial, deeply suspicious of strangers. The middle one is Finn, 6, and the most unpredictable. The youngest is Soren, 4. He doesn't speak to new people." She paused. "He doesn't speak at all, actually. Hasn't in nearly a year. The staff have been told not to make an issue of it." I absorbed that quietly. "One more thing," Hessa said, and her voice dropped just slightly, carrying something I hadn't heard in it before. Something careful. "The king is in a difficult season. He leads this territory in 12 allied packs. He carries it alone. His sons carry it in their own way. Whatever you see in this house, and you will see things that surprise you, you do not discuss it outside these walls." She held my gaze. "Are we clear?" "Completely," I said. She opened the door. The room beyond was catastrophic in the specific creative way of children who have had too much energy and too little direction. A bookshelf had been relocated, horizontally. 2 chairs had been pushed against the far wall and upholstered in what appeared to be an entire jar of honey. In the middle of it all stood 3 boys, the oldest with his arms crossed, and dark eyes locked on me with the focused hostility of someone 3 times his age. The middle one, holding something that might have been a toy, or might have been a small projectile. And the youngest, small, blonde like a field of wheat, standing slightly behind his brothers with his eyes on the floor. The oldest one, Roan, looked me over the way his father probably looked over challengers. "You won't last," he said. Not cruel, just certain, like a weather forecast. I set my bag down on the one clear surface in the room, a small table by the window, and looked around slowly. Took in the honey chairs, the horizontal bookshelf, the suspicious middle child now gripping his projectile with renewed interest. Then I looked back at Roan. "Maybe," I said. "But I just got here, so we won't know for a while." He blinked. Just once. Like I had said something that didn't compute. And in the corridor behind me, I heard the faint sound of Hessa's retreating footsteps. And something else. Quieter. The distant sound of a door, deeper in the house, closing with the firm, solitary click of someone who lived behind walls no one had yet found a way through. I didn't know, standing there in that ruined room with 3 feral, grieving children and honey on the furniture, that the click of that door would eventually matter to me more than almost anything. But I would. The first 3 days were a study in endurance. Not because the boys were violent. They weren't. Not exactly. They were strategic. Roan had clearly developed a system over the months of rotating staff, a kind of field-tested protocol for accelerating departure. He didn't break things in front of me directly. He simply arranged circumstances. On the first morning, I came downstairs to find that every single clean bowl in the kitchen had been moved to a high shelf I couldn't reach without a step stool, and the step stool had been relocated to the garden. In the rain, I made breakfast in mugs and didn't comment. Finn's approach was different, louder, more theatrical. He seemed genuinely curious about how much chaos a single room could contain before it collapsed into itself. He was the one who had deployed the honey. He was also, I noticed, watching me constantly from the corner of his eye, tracking my reactions with the sharp attention of a child who had learned that adults had a specific breaking threshold and was very interested in locating mine. I kept my expression level and my voice even, and I began quietly memorizing the geography of the house. Which drawers locked, which windows the boys had figured out how to open, where the good hiding spots were, because there is no childcare without knowing where children disappear to. Soren said nothing. He followed his brothers like a pale little shadow, watching everything, participating in none of the structured chaos. Once, on the second afternoon, I caught him looking directly at me, really looking, not the sideways glance he used on everyone else. And I smiled at him without making it into a thing, without leaning in or speaking or demanding any response. His eyes dropped back to the floor immediately. But he didn't move away from the doorway where he'd been standing. That felt like something. On the 4th morning, I woke before the house did. This was habit rather than effort. The rejection and everything that followed it had rewired my sleep into something shallow and watchful. I dressed quietly, went down to the kitchen, and was standing at the window with my hands wrapped around a warm mug when I heard footsteps in the corridor that were not small. They were the unhurried footsteps of someone who owned every floor they walked on. I didn't turn around immediately. I wasn't sure why. Maybe because I needed the extra second to arrange my face into something neutral. The kitchen was technically staff territory in the early hours, but this was his house, his pack, his territory in every sense that mattered. There were no rooms in Iron Peak that didn't belong to Draven Ashvale. "You're still here," he said. His voice was exactly what I should have expected and still somehow wasn't. Low, unhurried, with the particular texture of someone who chose every word with care and wasted none of them. I turned around. He was taller than I'd imagined, which was saying something, because I had already adjusted my mental image upward after seeing the scale of everything built for his use in this house. Dark hair, the shadow of exhaustion under his eyes that no amount of authority could quite conceal, wearing a simple dark shirt like someone who had been up working for hours. His eyes were gray, not pale gray but deep and layered, the color of clouds deciding whether to storm. He was looking at me with what I would come to recognize as his default expression. Not coldness exactly, but a very controlled distance. The face of someone who had learned that allowing people close had costs he wasn't always willing to pay. 4 days, I said, and was relieved that my voice came out steady. I believe the record is 9. Something moved at the edge of his expression. Not quite a smile. An acknowledgement, maybe. He moved to the other side of the kitchen and poured coffee with the automatic motion of someone who had done it 10,000 times alone. And I had the sudden, vivid understanding of how much of this man's life happened in solitude. Not the chosen solitude of someone who preferred quiet. The functional solitude of someone carrying too much to put down long enough to let anyone stand beside him. Hessa tells me there were no incidents yesterday, he said. Nothing worth reporting. He looked at me sideways, brief and assessing. Finn moved the furniture in the study. He moved it back, I said, after we discussed how rearranging someone else's space without asking is a form of claiming territory, which is a very adult behavior for someone who still sleeps with a stuffed bear. This time, the movement at the edge of his expression went slightly further. Still not a smile. But something. He doesn't like being called a child, Draven said. I know. That's why I framed it as a compliment to his instincts and a suggestion about channeling them. I paused. He responded well to being treated like someone capable of making a good choice instead of just being told not to make a bad one. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences I'd encountered in this house so far. Those had been loaded, with suspicion, with waiting, with the specific weight of children daring you to flinch. This one was more like the silence of someone actually listening. Roan, he said, after a moment. Just the name. Is grieving, I said quietly, and managing it the only way he knows how, which is by controlling his environment and testing the loyalty of anyone new before they can leave first. Draven was very still. I realized, a half second after the words left my mouth, that I had said something that cut closer than I intended. The parallel was not subtle. A boy who pushed people away before they could abandon him. And a father who had built an entire architecture of distance for what were probably the same reasons. I'm not a therapist, I added carefully. I've had practice reading rooms. He looked at me then. Fully, directly, in a way that felt different from the assessing glance of before. There was something in it that I couldn't name yet, something that sat beneath the controlled distance like a current beneath ice. Where were you before this? He asked. Fern Hollow Pack, I said. Northern Territory, mid-range. I kept my voice neutral. I was released from the pack bond 3 weeks ago. Released. The polite word. The word that didn't require explanation or pity. His expression didn't change, but something in the air did. A faint shift, like a recalibration. Alpha Kings know pack law better than anyone. He knew exactly what released from the bond meant, and what it didn't mean, and what it cost. He didn't offer sympathy. I was grateful for that. My sons have not had consistency, he said, and the words came out with the careful evenness of someone making an admission they didn't make often. The staff who came before, they left because the boys made it difficult, but also because this house makes it difficult. He seemed to consider whether to continue. I am not an easy presence. No, I agreed, honestly, but you're not meant to be easy. You're meant to be stable. He looked at me again with that unreadable, layered expression. That's an interesting distinction, he said. Your sons don't need easy, I said. Easy left. Easy didn't come back. What they need is someone who stays because they decide to, not because it costs them nothing. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window, the early light was just beginning to change the color of the sky over the tree line, pale gold pressing through the gray. Draven finished his coffee, set the cup down with the clean precision of someone who never made unnecessary movements. I have counsel today, he said, then a border meeting this evening. I won't be at dinner. I'll tell them, I said. He was almost at the door when I heard it. The soft sound of small feet on the staircase, careful and slow. We both turned. Soren stood in the kitchen doorway in his pajamas, pale hair mussed from sleep, a worn fabric rabbit hanging from one hand. He looked at me first. Then he looked at his father. Something passed over Draven's face so quickly I almost missed it. A fracture in the controlled surface. A flash of something enormous and unguarded. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and crouched down to his youngest son's level, and the shift was so complete and so sudden that it felt like watching a different person inhabit the same body. "Hey, little one," he said, voice lower, softer. Early morning. Soren didn't speak, but he leaned forward and pressed his forehead against his father's shoulder for exactly 4 seconds. I counted them without meaning to, and then stepped back and looked at me with those quiet eyes, and then at the counter where I'd left a bowl of fruit out the night before, because I had noticed he picked at it when he thought no one was watching. He walked to the counter, took a piece, sat down at the kitchen table. Draven stood slowly, his back to me for a moment, and I looked away to give him the privacy of whatever that 4 seconds had cost him. When he turned around, the distance was back in place. But it fit differently now, like a coat he was choosing to wear, rather than a wall that had always been there. "Good morning," I said to Soren, as lightly as if we were old friends sharing a Tuesday. He looked at his fruit, but the corner of his mouth did something small and involuntary. That, I thought, that was the thing to follow. I just didn't know yet that following it would lead me somewhere I hadn't thought to protect myself from. 2 weeks passed the way difficult things sometimes do. Not quickly, but with a kind of momentum that made you look up one morning and realize you were somewhere different than where you'd started. The honey incident was not repeated. This was not because Finn had lost interest in chaos. He hadn't, not remotely. But because I had, somewhere in the 2nd week, made a tactical decision to stop treating the chaos as something to be contained and start treating it as something to be redirected. Finn had extraordinary energy and a mind that ran about 4 steps ahead of most conversations. What he lacked was anyone who could keep up with him long enough to make the keeping up feel worth something. So I started giving him problems to solve. Not homework, not structured lessons with worksheets and consequences. Problems. Real ones. Practical puzzles embedded in the day. How many ways could you reorganize the kitchen storage to make breakfast faster? If 3 people needed different things at different times, what was the most efficient morning sequence? He attacked these questions with the same ferocity he'd previously applied to relocating furniture, and the difference was that now the furniture stayed where it belonged because he was busy optimizing something else. Roan watched this development with the suspicious attention of someone observing a potential trap. He was still guarded with me, still precise in the way he spoke, still careful not to show anything that could be read as need. But he had stopped moving things and locking things and arranging small inconveniences, and in the space where those behaviors had been, something quieter had appeared. He sometimes sat in the same room while I worked. He didn't speak, didn't ask for anything, but he was there. I didn't push it. I had learned, in the pack I'd grown up in, that trust with a wounded creature, human, wolf, or some complicated mixture of both, could not be demanded or scheduled. It arrived when it arrived, and the best thing you could do was be reliably present so that when it finally came looking, it found you there. Soren remained the quiet one, but the quality of his quiet had shifted. He had begun, in small and careful increments, to exist in my vicinity with something approaching comfort. He would sit across the room while I read aloud to his brothers in the evenings, a chapter of whatever book Roan had selected with great seriousness from the study shelves. And I would not look at him while I read, because I had noticed that being looked at made him retreat, but I would place the words carefully, the way you place food out for something wild, and sometimes I would hear the faint sound of him shifting closer. He still carried the rabbit everywhere. I had learned his name for it was Pip, not because he told me, but because Finn mentioned it once with the offhand familiarity of a brother, and I filed it away with everything else I was quietly learning about this fractured, fierce little household. It was on a Thursday. I remember because the council had been meeting all week. and the house carried the specific tension of important things happening behind closed doors, that Rowan finally spoke to me directly about something real. We were in the garden. I was attempting to untangle a climbing rose that had grown sideways across the stone wall for years, apparently undirected, and Rowan was sitting on the low wall nearby, ostensibly reading, but actually not reading. I could tell by the way he turned pages too quickly. "She used to do that," he said, without looking up. I didn't ask who. I waited. "The roses." He turned another page he hadn't read. "She planted them. She liked making things grow in places they weren't supposed to." The air was very still. I kept my hands moving carefully among the branches. "That sounds like someone who wasn't interested in being told what was possible," I said quietly. Rowan was silent for a moment. "She wasn't." He finally lowered the book, though he kept his eyes on the middle distance rather than me. "She died when Soren was 1. Finn barely remembers her. I remember enough." He said it with the terrible composure of an 8-year-old who had practiced that sentence until it stopped breaking his voice. "Soren stopped talking after. The doctor said it was a grief response, that it would pass." He paused. "It's been almost 3 years. I set down the clippers and sat on the low wall a few feet from him, not close enough to crowd him, just present. "Rowan," I said, "can I tell you something that I think is true, even though it might not feel good?" He looked at me sideways, cautious. "Soren talks," I said. "Not with words right now, but he talks. He's been talking to me for 2 weeks, with where he sits, and what he picks up, and what he puts back down, and whether his shoulders drop when I walk into the room." I kept my voice even, factual. "He's not silent. He's just waiting until the words feel safe again." Rowan stared at me for a long moment with those dark, ancient eyes. "How do you make words feel safe?" he asked. "You stop making them necessary," I said. "You just stay. And eventually the silence isn't about keeping things in anymore. It becomes about choosing when to let them out." The garden was quiet around us. Somewhere in the house I could hear Finn explaining something at great volume to no one in particular. A cloud moved across the sun and then moved away. Rowan picked up his book again, but he didn't open it. "The others left because of us," he said, and it wasn't a question. "The others left because this is a hard place," I said honestly. "And hard places ask a lot of people. Some people have more to give than others right now." "Why do you stay?" I looked at the rose bush, the sideways growing one, stubbornly alive against the stone wall. "Because I don't have anywhere easier to be," I said, "and because I think you're worth the difficulty." He didn't respond to that. But when I stood and picked up the clippers again, he moved his book to his lap and started actually reading it. And when Finn eventually exploded out of the back door to tell us about a logistical revelation he'd had about the kitchen pantry, Rowan looked up and said, with the weary authority of an older brother, "Daisy is working, Finn," which was, I realized, the first time he had used my name. That evening, Draven came to dinner. It was unexpected. He'd been absent from the table all week, eating at his desk or in the council room, and the boys had adapted to his absence with the practiced ease of children long accustomed to it. I had said nothing about it, made no commentary, simply kept the evening steady and the table set with enough warmth to offset the empty chair. But that Thursday, he appeared in the dining room doorway at exactly the hour dinner was served, still wearing the dark formal jacket from council meetings, and Finn immediately stood up on his chair. Not because he'd been taught to, simply because his body's response to excitement was always vertical. "You're here," Finn said, with the unguarded delight of a 6-year-old who had not yet learned to make that feeling smaller. "I'm here," Draven said, and something in his voice was different from the kitchen morning, less controlled, softer at the edges. He looked at the table, looked at the meal I'd made. Nothing elaborate, just food that was warm and substantial, and included the specific things each boy would eat without argument, because I had been paying close attention. Then he looked at me briefly. I began to move toward the kitchen to give the family space, which was my instinct, my training, the omega in me defaulting to the edges. But his voice stopped me. "Stay," he said, quiet and direct. I turned back. "There's enough at the table," he said, and pulled out a chair. I sat down, and it felt strange. Not uncomfortable, but significant in the way that small shifts sometimes are before you understand their full meaning. I was not staff eating in the kitchen. I was not a visitor at a formal table. I was something the household hadn't had in a long time, and didn't quite have a word for yet. Dinner was loud, because Finn had words saved up all day and released them in a continuous, enthusiastic stream. Roan corrected his brother's facts twice with the precision of a small academic. Soren ate quietly beside his father, and at some point, without announcement or preamble, leaned his small weight against Draven's arm the way he'd leaned his forehead against his shoulder in the kitchen that early morning. Draven did not stiffen, did not adjust, simply let his son lean. I watched the table, this difficult, layered, grief-carrying table, and felt something stir in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter and more durable. The feeling of a place that needed something you happened to have. When dinner ended and the boys were taken through their nighttime routines, I was washing dishes in the kitchen when I heard Draven come to stand in the doorway. "The council is pushing for a formal decision by the end of the month," he said, as though continuing a conversation we'd started. "About the Eastern Pac Alliance. It will require travel." "All right," I said, turning off the tap. "The boys." "Will be fine," I said. "I'll be here." He was quiet for a moment. When I turned around, he was looking at me with that layered, unreadable expression. Only tonight there was something moving through it that his controlled distance hadn't quite managed to contain. Something that looked, if I had to name it, almost like relief. "You said you had nowhere easier to be," he said. I met his eyes. "Yes." "I want you to know," he said carefully, as though weighing each word before releasing it, "that this place, I understand it asks a great deal." "It does," I agreed. "And He stopped, started again. "I notice what you're doing here, Daisy. For them." A pause. "It matters." He left the kitchen before I could answer, which was perhaps deliberate. Which was perhaps the only way he knew yet how to say something true without leaving himself entirely exposed. I stood in the quiet kitchen with my hands still damp and the warm wreckage of a real dinner behind me, and I thought about walls, the kind that keep things out, and the kind that keep things in, and whether, if you were patient and present and refused to leave, some walls eventually just became doors. The Eastern Alliance negotiations kept Draven away for 11 days. I knew he was gone the way you know a change in weather. Not because anyone announced it, but because the atmospheric pressure of the house shifted. The council members who moved through the corridor spoke more freely. The senior staff exhaled in small, collective ways. Even the stone walls seemed to breathe differently without the weight of his presence pressing through them. The boys felt it differently. Roan became quieter, more watchful, the way he'd been in the first days before he'd started trusting me. Finn's energy spiked in the directionless way of a compass with no north to orient toward. And Soren stopped eating breakfast the first morning, just sat at the table with Pip in his lap and his eyes on the door, and I understood without anyone explaining it that this was not the first time his father had left, and that each leaving carried the specific weight of every other one. I didn't try to substitute for what was absent. That was not something I could do, and pretending otherwise would have been a lie they'd see through immediately. What I did instead was make the days as solid and real as I could, textured with routine and small challenges and the kind of warmth that doesn't require a source to still be present in a room. I took them outside more. The pack territory surrounding the main residence was enormous. Old forest, a wide creek that ran fast and cold, open meadows where the tree line pulled back and the sky came in full. Roan knew every path by name. He walked ahead of us with his hands in his pockets, nominally leading, and I let him lead because it gave him something to carry. Finn discovered that the creek had excellent stones for skipping and became briefly, intensely devoted to mastering the technique. He had 17 attempts on the first afternoon and managed 3 skips on his best throw, which he announced to the forest at large with a volume that startled birds from the upper branches. Soren walked beside me. Not behind me, not ahead. Beside. His hand brushed mine twice in the first hour. Accidental both times, I thought, until the third time. When it wasn't accidental. When his small fingers simply closed around 2 of mine with the quiet certainty of a child who had made a decision. I kept walking. Kept my breathing even. Did not make it into anything it couldn't survive being made into. But I held on. We walked like that for a long time, through the old part of the forest where the trees grew so tall. Their canopy turned the afternoon light green and slow. And I thought about the specific courage it takes to reach for something when everything in your history has taught you that things you reach for tend to disappear. I thought about that more than I should have, for reasons that were becoming harder to be honest about. Hesse found me on the 6th evening, after the boys were asleep. I was in the small sitting room off the main corridor, a room I'd claimed quietly because it had a window that faced east and a lamp that cast warm light and bookshelves that had been arranged by someone with actual taste. I was reading, or trying to, because my mind kept doing the thing it had been doing for days, circling, returning, examining things that didn't require this much examination. Hesse sat down across from me with the directness of someone who had decided to say a thing and was simply locating the moment. "You've been here almost a month," she said. 26 days, I said. "The boys are different." She said it neutrally, as observation rather than compliment. Roan has been attending his morning lessons without incident. Finn reorganized the pantry in a way that is genuinely more efficient, which I would never admit to him directly. And Soren. She paused. Soren sat with me yesterday afternoon. He's never done that. I looked up from my book. He's beginning to feel safe, I said carefully. Hesse was quiet for a moment, her hands folded in her lap, her expression carrying the careful weight of someone about to say something they'd been considering for a while. "The king asked about you," she said. "From the Eastern Territory. He sent a communication regarding the household and asked specifically how the arrangement was proceeding." I kept my expression neutral. "That's reasonable. He's responsible for his sons." "He asked about you," Hesse repeated, with a slight emphasis that made the sentence mean something different the second time. I looked back at my book. "What did you tell him?" "The truth," she said. "That you were managing well, that the boys had responded to you in ways they hadn't responded to previous staff." She paused. "That you seemed to have no intention of leaving." The lamp flickered slightly in a draft from somewhere. "Daisy," Hesse said, and her voice shifted, lost its managerial precision, and became something more human. "I have worked in this house for 9 years. I was here before the boys were born. I was here when their mother was alive. And I was here when she wasn't." She looked at me steadily. "I have watched this man carry this pack and this grief for a very long time. I have watched the boys grow difficult and frightened in ways they can't articulate." She stopped. "I am not telling you anything. I am simply observing that what you have done in 26 days is not nothing. And that sometimes people arrive in a house and fit the shape of what's missing in ways that have nothing to do with job descriptions." She stood, smoothed her jacket, and was entirely Hesse again by the time she reached the door. "Get some sleep," she said. "The king returns day after tomorrow." He came back on a gray afternoon, when the sky was pressing low and the wind had the metallic edge of incoming rain. I knew he'd arrived before I heard anything. The house changed again, the pressure returning, and I felt it in my chest before I consciously registered it. A shift like the moment before a held breath is released. I was in the upstairs corridor when I heard the main door, heard Finn's immediate thundering descent of the staircase, heard Rowan's more measured footsteps following. I stayed where I was. This was not my moment to be present for. This was theirs, but I heard it all. Finn's torrent of words, Rowan's careful, dignified greeting that cracked slightly at the edges, the low murmur of Draven's voice responding to both of them with a patience and warmth he didn't display in any other context. I heard him ask where Soren was, heard Finn say upstairs probably. He does that. And then I heard footsteps on the stairs. Not the boy's footsteps. He appeared at the top of the staircase and found me in the corridor, and we looked at each other across 20 feet of quiet hallway, with the particular awareness of two people who had been in each other's thoughts, in an absence neither had fully accounted for. "You're back," I said, and immediately understood why he'd said that to me that first morning in the kitchen. Sometimes the simple things are all you have. "I'm back," he said. He looked tired. Not the surface-level tired of someone who hadn't slept, though that too, but the deeper kind. The tired of someone who had been performing strength for 11 days in front of people who needed to believe in it, and had now walked back into the one place where that performance wasn't required of him. "Soren," he said. Just the name, quiet. "Third door," I said. "He's been going there in the afternoons. It gets the best light." He nodded and moved down the corridor, and I turned to go back downstairs, and then his voice came again behind me. "Daisy." I turned. He was standing at the third door, one hand resting on the frame, looking back at me with that expression. The layered one, the one with the current moving beneath the ice. 11 days had done something to it. The control was still there, but it was sitting differently. The way clothes sit differently on someone who has been through something. "Thank you," he said, "for staying." It was 2 words. It landed like something much heavier. "That's the job," I said lightly, because I didn't know yet what else to do with the weight of it. He looked at me a moment longer. "No," he said, "it isn't." He opened the door and went in, and I heard, before it closed behind him, the sound that would stay with me longer than anything else from those 11 days. A small sound, barely there. Soren's voice, not words, not yet. Just a sound, high and soft and unguarded. The particular sound a child makes when the person they've been waiting for finally comes home. I walked down the stairs with my hand on the banister and my eyes on my feet, and I told myself firmly that the feeling in my chest was relief for the boys, and gratitude for a household finding its footing, and absolutely nothing more complicated than that. I was not entirely convincing. That evening after dinner, while Finn described his 17 creek-skipping attempts in exhaustive chronological detail, and Roan corrected the physics of it with a patience I was fairly certain he'd learned by observation, Draven looked across the table at me exactly once, briefly. The way you look at something you're being careful about. But I felt it for the rest of the evening, in the particular way that a single glance from the right person can rearrange the temperature of a room. Outside, the rain finally arrived, heavy and steady against the windows, the kind that settles in for the night, the kind that makes everything inside feel more contained, more deliberate, more chosen. I passed the bread to Finn. I listened to Roan's physics. I watched Soren eat an entire bowl of soup without once checking the door. And I stayed, because it was the only true thing I knew how to do. The night everything shifted began quietly, the way the most consequential nights tend to. It was a Saturday, 5 weeks after I'd arrived, and the Pack's inner council had gathered at Iron Peak for a formal assembly, the kind that filled the lower halls with ranked wolves from 12 allied territories, all of them carrying the specific energy of people who held power, and were accustomed to displaying it. The house smelled different that evening, sharper, more territorial. The kind of gathering that reminded every Omega within its radius of exactly where they stood in the hierarchy of things. I had kept the boys upstairs through most of it. Finn had opinions about this. Roan had accepted it with the pragmatic understanding of someone who knew that certain battles were not worth the cost. Soren had simply stayed close to me, which he did now with a naturalness that no longer felt tentative. Just real. Just his. I had put them all to bed by 9. Later than usual because Finn had negotiated an extension based on a technicality in what I'd said the previous Thursday, and I was genuinely impressed enough by the argument to grant it. By 9:30, the corridor was quiet, 3 doors closed, and I was moving back toward the stairs when I heard voices from the lower hall. Not the ambient noise of the assembly. Specific voices. Targeted. I stopped at the top of the stairs because I recognized one of them. A council elder named Voss, whose name I'd heard from Hessa with the careful tone she reserved for people who required managing. He had a voice that carried, the kind that was used to rooms adjusting around it. The question of the king's household is a pack matter, Voss was saying. 3 heirs with no formal guidance, raised by rotating staff. It reflects instability at the center. The alliance packs are watching. Another voice, lower. He's found someone who's stayed. An unmated Omega with no pack bond, Voss said, and the words were precise and deliberate. Rejected by her own. What does it say about the king's judgment that this is who tends his sons? That this is who he allows proximity to his heirs? I stood very still on the staircase. She has no standing, Voss continued. No rank, no lineage, no claim. The boys are becoming attached to someone who, by every formal measure, should not be here. And the king, a pause with weight in it, is not behaving like a man who remembers what his position requires. The second voice said something too quiet to catch. Voss's response was not quiet. Find me grounds and I'll have her removed by morning. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough for the cold of the stone floor to come up through my feet. Long enough for every familiar feeling to find its way back. The invisibility, the insufficiency, the old deep certainty that no matter where you placed yourself, you were always one formal decision away from being erased, rejected by her own. No standing, should not be here. I had heard versions of this before. I knew its shape and its weight, and exactly how it worked its way in through the places you'd left unguarded. I went back upstairs. I did not go to my room. I went to the window at the end of the corridor, the one that faced the forest. And I stood there in the dark, and I breathed, because that was what there was to do. I heard him before I saw him. The unhurried footsteps that had become, without my fully noticing, a sound I knew the way you know weather. Draven came to stand beside me at the window. Not behind me, not across the hall. Beside. He looked out at the dark tree line and said nothing immediately, and I understood that he had heard it too, or had been told, or had known something was coming, and had come to find me before I had to find myself. You heard Voss, he said. Not a question. Enough of it, I said. He's not wrong about your formal standing, he said, and I respected him for not softening it. By pack law, an unbonded Omega without territory has limited protections in a formal household. I know pack law, I said. I know you do. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the upper branches of the old trees, slow and dark. He is wrong about everything else. I turned to look at him. In the low light of the corridor, with the assembly noise a distant murmur below us, he looked less like the Alpha King than he ever had, or maybe more like him, the real version, the one that existed when the performance of power was not required. Daisy. He said my name the way he'd been saying it for weeks, carefully, like something he was getting used to being allowed. What you have done in this house. what you have done for my sons. I need you to understand that I see it. All of it. Not as a function of your position. As a choice you made every single day when you could have left. I didn't want to leave, I said, and it came out more honest than I'd intended. I know, he said, and then quieter. Neither do I. Want you to leave. The corridor was very still. I am not good at this, he said, and the admission cost him something I could see him paying. I have spent 4 years being good at everything except this. Except the things that happen inside this house. Inside. He stopped. I have kept distance because distance is safe. Because everything I have allowed close has... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I know about loss, I said quietly. I know about building walls and calling it survival. Yes, he said. I think you do. We stood together at the window, and outside the forest was dark and old and entirely indifferent to pack law and formal standing, and the question of what an unbonded Omega was doing in the Alpha King's corridor at 10 o'clock at night, her shoulder almost touching his. I want to change your standing, he said, formally, permanently. He turned to look at me directly, and his eyes in the low light were that deep layered gray, the color of clouds that had decided. Not because of Voss, not because of the council or the alliance pacts or what it reflects about my judgment. He paused. Because you walked into a room full of children who had made it their purpose to be walked away from, and you stayed. Because you found a rose my son's mother planted, and you didn't let it grow sideways forever. Because my youngest son, who has not spoken in 3 years, made a sound when I came home, and I believe, I know, that is because of you. I felt something in my chest that was not manageable. Because when I came into this house, he continued, I felt it, even before I understood what it was. He held my gaze. I feel it now. Draven, I said, and my voice was not entirely steady. I'm asking you to stay, he said, not as staff, not as a formal arrangement. I'm asking you to stay as someone who belongs here, if you want to. The window held the dark. Below us the assembly was winding down, Voss and his careful arguments dispersing into the night. Above us 3 boys slept in 3 rooms. One with a worn rabbit, one dreaming of creek stones, one with a book still open on his pillow. I want to, I said. What followed was not simple. I want to be honest about that, because nothing real is. There were council objections. Voss presented a formal challenge that Draven addressed in the assembly the following morning, with a precision and authority that left no procedural avenue unexplored, and no argument standing. I was not present for it, but Hessa was, and she described it to me afterward with the compressed satisfaction of someone who had waited 9 years to watch exactly that happen. There was a pack ceremony, 6 weeks later, in the old formal courtyard under an October sky the color of cold iron. A rebonding rite, not reinstatement to a lost pack, but something rarer. A formal claiming of unbonded status into a new bond, into Iron Peak, into the king's household by the king's own declaration. Every allied pack in attendance, 12 territories watching. I stood in the courtyard in the clothes Hessa had selected, with the fierce practicality of someone who understood that appearances carried arguments. And I was aware of every eye in that space. The assessing ones, the skeptical ones, the ones waiting for me to look uncertain. I didn't look uncertain, because I wasn't. Roan stood to my left, his dark eyes straight ahead, his spine very straight. He had asked, 2 days before the ceremony, if he could stand beside me. He'd asked it with the careful dignity of someone who had thought about it for a long time and decided to be brave. Finn stood to my right, vibrating with barely contained ceremony energy, and I had made him promise 3 specific things about behavior, all of which he honored, though it visibly cost him. Soren stood in front of me. Draven faced us all, and when the formal words were spoken, the declaration, the bond acknowledgement, the pack recognition, Soren turned around and looked up at me with his quiet eyes, and then he opened his mouth. "Daisy," he said. One word. My name. In a voice like something that had been kept very safe for a very long time, and had finally found the moment to come out. The courtyard was absolutely silent. Finn made a sound that was either a sob or a hiccup, and was probably both. Roan put his hand in mine, quickly, briefly, just a squeeze, and then let go and looked straight ahead again as though it hadn't happened. Hessa, standing at the edge of the courtyard, turned slightly away and found something extremely interesting in the middle distance. Draven looked at his youngest son, and then at me, and the wall was gone. Entirely, completely gone. And what was underneath it was not frightening at all. It was just him, tired and real and present. The man who crouched on kitchen floors and carried things alone, and had kept every feeling at careful distance until something small and stubborn and blonde arrived in a ruined room and simply refused to leave. He reached out and took my hand. We stood in the cold courtyard with 12 territories watching, and it was nothing like the stories I'd grown up with. Not triumphant, not cinematic, not the kind of recognition that arrives with music and grandeur. It was quieter than that. Truer. I was not the girl who had been rejected in front of 63 witnesses. I was not the Omega with no standing, no bond, no formal claim to anything. I was not the version of myself that had walked through Iron Peak's doors with a worn canvas bag and 4 sentences of reference and absolutely nothing to lose. I was Daisy. I was bonded to a pack that had needed exactly what I had. I was standing in a courtyard with a child saying my name for the first time. A boy holding my hand and pretending he hadn't. A king looking at me like I was the thing he'd stopped letting himself look for. I was someone who had stayed. And staying, it turned out, had been the bravest thing I'd ever done. Not because it cost nothing, but because it had cost everything I'd been afraid to spend. The wind came across the courtyard, cold and clean, and somewhere in the old forest, behind the stone walls, the trees moved together in the way old things do when something has finally settled into place. Soren leaned back against my legs, warm and solid and present, and I held on.